So having looked at World War I tanks from most of the nations involved in World War I, it's now time to finally look at the tanks used and developed by the Italians, both during and just after this conflict, and how I think they could fit into War Thunder. So as we've touched on in previous episodes, tanks primarily came about on the Western Front due to the need to break trench warfare, so tended to be large lumbering machines with slow speeds. While on the Eastern Front, tanks developed by Russia tended to emphasise speed due to the vast distances on this front. For the Italians, they were fighting primarily in mountainous areas and valleys, with at least 12 battles occurring in the Isonzo Valley over the course of the war, and these terrains tended to be unsuitable for large tanks, which was something that would affect Italian tank designs all the way up to just before World War II. Though of course there was more suitable terrain for tank use nearer the coasts and in the Italian colonies. Given these limitations, Italy surprisingly decided to start off by designing the Fiat 2000, which was a heavy tank that would end up weighing 40 tonnes when finished, becoming the heaviest tank to go into service in World War I. Being a heavy tank, the Fiat 2000 was heavily armoured, with the main structure of the tank being 20mm thick, reducing to 15mm at the rear of the tank, while armoured skirts protected the tracks. This might not sound like a lot of armour, but bear in mind the armour for most other tanks of this time rarely exceeded 15mm, so this is a pretty well protected tank in that context. But in game the armour might potentially perform even better because this is actual battleship armour, or more specifically vanadium armour plate that was originally intended for the Italian battleship Cristoforo Colombo. I've probably mispronounced that. A battleship that would be laid down but never actually completed. And so this armour might actually be better quality than that usually seen in game, though whether Gaijin would decide to actually implement it in that way, I'm not sure. The armament is also pretty impressive, with a 65mm mounting gun in a rotating turret, and this was capable of firing AP, HE and shrapnel shells to good effect against enemies. It was also capable of firing an EP or a Fretto Pronto shell, and an EPS or a Fretto Pronto Speciale shell, the former acting as a basic Hess shell and the latter as a heat shell. But as these are more modern ammunition types, I doubt they would be available on the Fiat 2000, at least not in its World War I configuration. To round out the armament, 8 6.5mm Fiat machine guns were fitted throughout the tank, 3 at the rear, 2 at the front and 1 on each side, giving 360-degree coverage of the tank. Unfortunately, due to its extreme weight and only using a 250 horsepower petrol engine, speed is extremely limited, maxing out at only 4.6 miles per hour or 7.5 kilometers an hour, which is pretty damn slow, though not horrifically so compared to other nations' tanks, and the turret does at least offset the threat of flanking by faster enemies compared to some of the other nations' tanks which only have frontally mounted armament. Lastly, a crew of 10 would be required to man all of the weapons and operate the tank, though some sources say that a crew of 8 was usually carried, as not all the weapons would need manning all the time, and crew members could move between the weapons as needed. But regardless, the large crew in game would give a lot of redundancy in the event of crew losses. In War Thunder, the Fiat 2000 would easily be one of the toughest World War I tanks in game, and I would suggest adding it at a battle rating of 0.3 to 0.7, as it is heavily armed and armoured, and as mentioned does feature a lot of redundancy to crew losses due to its large crew complement. And while let down by its slow speed, I think the Fiat 2000 would be a popular tank to use in the very early tiers, and would quickly become a fan favourite. In real life, only 2 Fiat 2000 would be made, and while one of these was available during World War I, it didn't see combat service in the conflict. But after World War I they were sent to fight in Libya, but due to their low speed they seem to have missed out on any combat. Later on one would be modified with more modern weapons, but we shall leave that tank for an episode looking at interwar Italian tanks. Ultimately what killed the Fiat 2000 project in the end was the availability of French tanks, starting initially with one Schneider CA1 which was used for training, and later on in 1918 4 French Renault FT-17 light tanks were sent, these being armed with a mix of 37mm guns and machine guns, and the Italians were impressed enough with these tanks that they set about producing their own version, though some of the existing FT-17s saw service in Libya post-war. Now, before we move on to the Italian copy, I'd like to quickly look at a modification of one of these FT-17s, which became the Semavente 105/14, which was based on one of these 4 Renault FT-17s. The new main armament is a 105mm howitzer, and this is placed where the turret and superstructure used to be, and uniquely it is pointed backwards, which does introduce the hassle of having to turn the vehicle around to engage enemies, and potentially leaves you vulnerable to enemies when you're travelling towards them. However, the 105mm howitzer is capable of firing AP and HE shells, and these are much more capable of destroying enemy tanks than the original armament, as few enemies will be able to withstand the effects of incoming fire from this gun, though ammunition will also be limited as it was intended to be carried by a separate vehicle. And as you can see in the picture, this does come at the cost of armour. Like I said, if you're already travelling towards the enemy and they manage to get a shot on you, they're going to quickly kill all of the gun crew, so this vehicle's probably going to excel more in ambush situations where there will be at least a little bit of cover from enemy machine gun fire via the gun shield. But like I say, generally your main aim is going to be avoiding enemy fire at all cost, although at least the driver still appears to be protected by the original armour. Speed and crew complement would likely be a little bit different from the FT-17, as the Semavente 105/14 is no doubt heavier, resulting in slower speeds, while the crew complement will now probably be nearer to 3 or 4, 1 to drive the tank and 2 or 3 to man the gun. In real life this remained a one-off prototype, but in game I could see this being a 0.3 vehicle, as its powerful gun will make short work of most enemies, especially like I said in ambush situations, where its weak points like the lack of armour, rear-facing armament and slow speed will be a much lesser issue, and I could see skilled players having some success with this SPG. So like I say, that was a modification of one of the FT-17s, but like I mentioned earlier, Italy produced their own version of the FT-17, this being the Fiat 3000. Now this isn't a straight copy and it's got quite a few big differences. For example, the weight is reduced from 6.5 to 5.5 tonnes, and it is fitted with a new more powerful engine of 50 horsepower, resulting in a top speed of 13.6 miles per hour or 22 kilometers an hour, compared to the original FT-17's top speed of 5 miles per hour or 8 kilometers an hour. So the Fiat 3000 is a much faster vehicle than the tank it is based on. Unfortunately, there is a massive downgrade in the armament, which is now only 2 6.5mm machine guns, severely limiting its effectiveness against enemy tanks, though AP bullets can still pose a threat in some cases. Meanwhile, the armour is a respectable 16mm for the front and sides, while the crew remains at 2, a driver in the hull and a commander in the turret. Overall, 150 of these tanks would be built, and it can be considered one of the better designs of the early 1920s, with its good mix of speed and armour, and while its armament is lacklustre in game, in real life it was more than enough to deal with enemies in the Italian colonies, especially since they lacked any anti-tank weapons. In War Thunder, the Fiat 3000 would have to go at 0.0 just on account of the machine gun armament, but I could see it being successful in flanking attacks, this being made possible due to its quick speed, though of course it would suffer in any head-on engagements. The Fiat 3000 would go on to see service in Libya and the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, with a few of these even seeing service in World War II, and it would go through a variety of upgrades during the 1920s. But again, like with the Fiat 2000, we will cover these in an episode looking at Italian interwar tanks. So that is all of the Italian tanks that were used during or just after World War I. I'd be interested to hear your views on these tanks, as well as any other tanks you'd like me to cover. I look forward to reading your comments below. So anyway, that's the end of this episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Terreno, and I'll see you next time.